BBC News at 6 o'clock. This is Zeb Soanes. Good evening. Boris Johnson has suffered a major setback in his drive to get Parliament to support him over Brexit. Sitting on a Saturday for the first time since the invasion of the Falklands, MPs backed moves which obliged the Prime Minister to ask for a 3-month delay by 11 p.m. tonight. In a defiant riposte, Mr Johnson said he would not negotiate a further delay, prompting Jeremy Corbyn to demand that he comply with the law. The European Commission said Britain must now inform the EU of its next steps as soon as possible. In tonight's bulletin, we'll hear from Parliament, from the protesters outside who are campaigning for a second referendum, and from Birmingham, where voters say they are fed up with the time it's taking to get Brexit done. Also tonight, joy for England as they beat Australia in the Rugby World Cup, but disappointment for Ireland after a thrashing by the All Blacks. Boris Johnson has suffered another setback in his attempt to take the UK out of the EU by the end of the month. A day which the government hoped would be pivotal in securing Brexit has ended in defeat, and by a bigger margin than ministers had feared. In the first Saturday session of Parliament since 1982, which was called to approve the deal Mr Johnson had struck in Brussels, MPs instead backed an amendment put forward by the former Conservative Minister Sir Oliver Letwin. It withholds the support of the Commons until all the relevant legislation is passed in order to prevent a no-deal Brexit, but in effect it forces the Prime Minister to ask the EU for another delay. The result of the vote was announced by the Speaker, John Bercow.
The ayes to the right, 322. The noes to the left, 306. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlocked.
Outside the Palace of Westminster, crowds of Remain supporters calling for a second referendum watched the result on a big screen.
322. 306.
Boris Johnson began the day by telling MPs that his Brexit deal offered a chance to heal the rift in politics and move the country forward. Instead, the day seemed to deepen divisions. Our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, was following developments.
Far from the do-or-die moment of clarity that Boris Johnson had sought, today has ended in defeat, confusion and a possible further delay to Brexit, a reverse spearheaded by those rebel Tories so recently expelled from the party. This afternoon, they, the DUP and the opposition parties formed an unlikely alliance to force Mr Johnson to seek a further Brexit extension to avoid no deal, an outcome that prompted a furious Prime Minister to abandon the vote on his deal and instead to send his MPs home, a move designed to underscore his belief that his meaningful vote had been made meaningless. Nevertheless, it does now mean that Mr Johnson is under a legal obligation to write a letter to the EU to ask for more time. In the immediate aftermath of defeat, however, the Prime Minister remained defiant.
I continue in the very strong belief that the best thing for the UK and for the whole of Europe is for us to leave with this new deal on October the 31st. And to anticipate the questions that are coming from the benches opposite, I will not negotiate a delay with the EU.
The Prime Minister's bullish tone sparked fears he might refuse to send the letter, prompting this from the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn.
The Prime Minister must now comply with the law.
And this was the response of the SNP's Westminster leader Ian Blackford.
Any failure of a Prime Minister who thinks he's above the law, well, Prime Minister, you'll find yourself in court.
Although Downing Street have always said Mr Johnson would comply with the law, tonight they offered no guidance. It led some MPs to ask the Speaker, John Bercow, whether he would be prepared to write such a letter.
Short answer to the Honourable and Learned Lady is that if I were instructed by this House, I would do as instructed, and if I were directed or instructed by a court, I would do as directed.
Meanwhile, in a further sign of Mr Johnson's determination not to back down, it was confirmed that the government would bring back the Prime Minister's deal for a further meaningful vote on Monday, a move fraught with risks. But clearly the hope in government circles is that with the threat of no deal potentially removed, Tory rebels may be ready to come on board. Significantly, the leader of today's revolt, the Tory MP Sir Oliver Letwin, suggested he would now be ready to back the Prime Minister's deal.
We will be voting for it. We will continue to vote for it. We will seek to ensure that it becomes the law before the 31st of October. And if it does so become the law, this country will leave on the 31st of October.
Sir Oliver's intervention will give the Prime Minister hope that from the ashes of today's defeat he could yet resurrect his Brexit deal. It is, though, far from straightforward. The parliamentary numbers remain daunting, and until the EU has actually received Mr Johnson's letter and agreed to an extension, Mr Johnson's opponents will remain wary. The battle between the Prime Minister and Parliament would seem very far from over.
During 5 hours of debate on his deal, the Prime Minister won support from the Brexiteers of the European Research Group. His predecessor, Theresa May, also urged MPs to vote for the agreement.
The eyes of the country, no, actually the eyes of the wider world are upon us today. And every member in this House has a responsibility in the decision that they will take to determine on whether or not they are going to put the national interest first, and not just an ideological or a single issue or a party political interest, but the full wider interests of our constituents.
6 Labour MPs who've backed Brexit defied their party leadership and voted against any further delay. One of them, Caroline Flint, criticised the amendment put forward by Sir Oliver Letwin as another attempt to block the process.
In voting for the amendment by the Right Honourable Member for Dorset West, we will be forced, even if a deal is approved, to seek an extension to the 31st of January, underlying that the sponsors of the Benn Act had only one motivation, and that was to delay Brexit and stop it.
But there were also vocal critics of the Prime Minister's deal. Plaid Cymru's Westminster leader Liz Saville-Roberts dismissed it as a billionaire's Brexit. Sammy Wilson of the Democratic Unionists said Northern Ireland had been left within the clutches of the EU.
Will he accept that he may have avoided a regulatory border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, but he has put a legal, customs and economic border between the country to which we belong and the economy to which we depend? Rather than a great